The best of the week on Relevant Radio.
Vladimir Putin throwing down the gauntlet over Ukraine, saying the West will face a nuclear conflict if they put troops in to help Ukraine.
Strategic nuclear forces are in a state of full readiness for use. We remember the fate of those who sent their contingents to the territory of our country. Now the consequences for the potential interventionists will be much more tragic.
Yeah, we have heard the saber-rattling, is what I'll call it at this point, of Vladimir Putin threatening to use nuclear weapons in the past. We have, of course, heard him just a week ago also mention that. I read an article about 3 NATO allies who could possibly be targeted. We know that China is really building up its nuclear arsenal. We know a lot of other nations are racing, to get nuclear weapons, to have them. Ever since the first nuclear weapon was dropped, that atomic bomb in 1945, popes have consistently called for nuclear disarmament in general. And that was true of Pius XII, as it was for Pope John the 23rd and Pope Paul VI and John Paul II and Benedict XVI. You can see this thread through the pontificates. And Pope Francis, of course, has repeated the same call, which today it falls on deaf ears. It has increased the stakes for that even further right now because, he said a couple years back, not only is the use of nuclear weapons immoral, but even the mere possession of them is immoral. He said this in 2022. He said, trying to defend and ensure stability and peace through a false sense of security and a balance of terror sustained by a mentality of fear and mistrust inevitably ends up poisoning relationships between peoples and obstructing any possible form of real dialogue. So 2 Sundays ago, he went further and he upped the ante. He said in his audience, he has these weekly Angelus gatherings. He said this, he says, the international community will understand that disarmament is first and foremost a duty and that disarmament is a moral obligation. And he wasn't just talking about disarmament of nuclear weapons here. He was talking about disarming all weapons. And of course, that builds off a tweet he sent out in 2018. And he said, do you really want peace? Then let's ban all weapons so we don't have to live in the fear of war. I would love it. Oh my gosh, would I love it. Wouldn't it be great? Not have to worry about your children and your children's children or your life being annihilated by some nuclear conflagration. Imagine if there was a world without these type of weapons. There was a different form of justice. Of course, it raises lots of moral questions. What about smaller people who might live in fear of being attacked by larger people? You see Russia going into Ukraine. They're mightier, more powerful. They have more weapons. Will we see people begin to do what they've done throughout the centuries, throughout the ages? The stronger, the ones with might, go and take over the weaker. What about those who might use legitimate objects for protection? Not necessarily guns and cannons and other things. What about just war? There's a lot to talk about. So I've invited Msgr. Stuart Swetland, who's the president of Donnelly College in Kansas City, Kansas, to join us. You remember him. He was on the air with us for years. He serves as the executive secretary for the Fellowship of Catholic Scholars, and it's always good to tap into his expertise here. Msgr, thank you for joining me. Good afternoon.
Great to be with you, Drew, as we enter the second half of Lent.
Yeah, so let's start with just disarmament in general. We can always talk nuclear weapons. Nuclear weapons make sense. The Holy Father seems to keep upping the ante on this question of weaponry. What's he saying? Let me start there. And then realistically, you served in our nation's military. I don't know how we'd ever get to that point. I don't know how nations don't trust each other. I mean, how would we ever get to nuclear disarmament, let alone disarmament in general?
Well, here we have to do some parsing of what the Church teaches. The Church continues to teach, it's in the Catechism quite clearly, that those in position of authority have the duty, the moral duty, it's an obligation, to defend the innocent from unjust aggression. That would be true for, the policing of inside of a nation, and of course, defending innocent people from unjust aggression or unjust threats to their life and livelihood. So there is a duty to defend. That being said, what the Holy Father is emphasizing is any system that's based on mutual fear not mutual trust, is inherently unstable and leads to bad consequences like we see right now in many parts of the world, not the least of which is the Middle East and Ukraine. So he's calling for us, as we should always be working, to limit the amount of spending we need, amount of resources we need, amount of people we need to carry out that duty to defend, not have it go from small to medium to large. Now, the good news, Drew, is since I was born and since you were born, if you look worldwide, when I was born in 1959, between 6 and 6.5% of all the world's expenditures were on defense, just talking military defense in this case. That number's down to more between 2 and 2.5 today. So we've had a general trend down, especially after we've ended the Cold War. But what the Holy Father is cautioning is that curve, which has generally been going down, is beginning to go up again. And we see the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, both very negative things.
I love it. I mean, a world where nations would choose trust over fear, dialogue over destruction. I mean, it's a challenge that goes beyond mere policy. I wonder how we get there. I mean, it's a call to transform, I think, the very ethos of our civilizations. I mean, how many of our global adversaries could be alleviated? How would relationships change? If we dare to disarm, the possession of nuclear weapons, the Holy Father goes as far to say, is immoral. We live in a time, though, where we reject God. We embrace immorality, Monsignor. How do we begin this dialogue? Are there steps that lead to somehow embracing this broad vision of the Holy Father? I mean, as I said, it's an incredible vision.
Well, it is. I must admit, as soon as I read it, I thought right back to what Sir Michael Howard taught me at Oxford when I was studying with him military history, that if you go right back to the wars between Athens and Sparta and look at what Thucydides says, he said, and I'm paraphrasing here, but it's close to the actual quotation, it was the rise of power in Athens and the fear that inspired in Sparta that made war inevitable. Yep. Centuries before Christ, the Greeks recognized that mutual fear, the rise of power in one place and the fear that causes in another place, makes war inevitable. What the Holy Father is trying to say is there's a better way. Dialogue and trust is better than war and destruction.
Amen to that. Terry, you're on with Monsignor. Go ahead.
Okay, well, my dad was the last guy to drop a nuclear weapon, and that was on Nagasaki, Japan.
Wow.
And, he was part of the Manhattan Project, and he knew Oppenheimer and all this other stuff, obviously. And it's a long story about, the first bomb and the second bomb, but he was ordered to do the second one. He was the only guy to fly on both missions. He was on Tibbet's right wing, and they dropped a bunch of measuring equipment, but they didn't even know if they were going to die. They didn't even know if the world was going to go up.
Wow.
I mean, they really didn't know. But my dad's plane has this measuring equipment with all the scientists. The guy on the left wing is the guy that took all the pictures that you see on History Channel and all that stuff. So they come back, Tibbetts comes back, all three planes, and, we're waiting to see if we have to drop the second one, if they'll surrender. And they wouldn't surrender. So, and the surrender was unconditional. Yep. You have to do what we say. So, my daddy goes, listen, Charlie, if we need to drop the next one, you're going to do it. He said, yes, sir. He said, same tactics, 3 planes, 30,000 feet. He said, same tactics. And he said, inside his head, he goes, Colonel, don't you think the Japanese are going to be a little bit wiser if they see 3? He goes, just do it. He said, all right. And he said, you follow Tibbetts no matter what. He was such a great leader. Wow. My dad, Nagasaki wasn't the primary target. Right. They had orders to land, to bomb visually. So they went to Kokura, which was the primary target. So the secondary target was Nagasaki. Yep. So they headed over to Nagasaki, and they were really low on fuel. Right? They didn't even have 600 pounds of fuel before they took off.
Wow.
And his the guy that does watches the fuel web says, "Hey, we got to get out of here. We got to drop this thing and go." Anyway, they went over to Nagasaki, and it was clouded too. But the bombardier says, I got it. And he takes over the plane. They drop it. and they couldn't get back to Tinian because they had hardly any gas.
Yep.
They landed at Okinawa with 30 gallons of gas and a B-29.
Hey, Terry, did your father ever regret doing that, or did he feel, like a hero for ending the war?
Okay, so good question. So he told us, as children, he says, it was an order. He says, I'm in the military, and it's an order. You don't question, your boss, obviously. Secondly, he said it was the only thing to do at that time. He said, we were losing guys in the Pacific like 1,000 a day.
Mm-hmm.
And we just wanted to get this thing over. And so he thought, and we only had 2 bombs, but we had to fake them out to make it sound like we had a lot.
Yep. And
Tibbetts came up to my dad the next day and says, okay, we're going to do the next one. And he went out and did it. He said in his book, it's called War's End, he said, I hope that there'll never, ever, ever be a nuclear drop on anything ever again.
Yeah.
Now, my mom said he had nightmares.
Wow.
Okay, bad nightmares. We didn't know until he died because he didn't know there was a Jesuit missionary in Nagasaki, that he sent money there every year, as kind of maybe a reparations for him and his head.
Mm-hmm.
But we never knew about it until he died. We're going, what's this thing going out here to Nagasaki?
Wow, amazing.
So
amazing story. Terry, thank you. Thank you for sharing.
You're very welcome.
I'd love you to call back again when we talk about this. I know the anniversary date was August 9th, 1945, and quite often we look at the bombing of Hiroshima as well as Nagasaki around that time. Monsignor, you heard the son of the last man to drop an atomic weapon, a nuclear weapon on a city. Your thoughts and maybe some perspective.
This is why once war is afoot, all kinds of these kind of things happen. But we also have to learn from history. And fortunately, it's there for people who want to see it. The U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey went back and looked at what we did in World War II, particularly the decision to drop the nuclear devices and the question of surrender. And the best military minds do it with access to Japanese leaders by that time. This was written right at the end of 45 and 46. It says, and I quote, based on a detailed investigation of all the facts and supported by the testimony of the surviving Japanese leaders involved, it is the survey's opinion that certainly prior to 31 December 1945, and in all probability prior to 1 November 1945, Japan would have surrendered even if the atomic bombs had not been dropped, even the Russians had not entered the war, and even if no invasion had been planned or contemplated. So we know after the fact that we didn't need to drop the bombs, despite what some historians have put forward. This is not the facts. But when war is afoot, when war happens, the first casualty often is truth, and the second casualty often is morality. The saying, all is fair in love and war. Mm-hmm. Well, that's a lie. All is not fair in love. There are strict moral truths about how we use our human sexuality. And all is not fair in war. There are just war principles, which include not attacking civilians, not attacking indiscriminately, not destroying whole cities with their populations. So hopefully we'll learn from history so we don't repeat it.
Well, it brings us back to the Holy Father's call for the moral obligation for disarmament. I think about, I don't know what the total death toll was, 40 to 75,000 people, thousands more suffering from injuries as a result of radiation exposure after, I think, the Nagasaki bomb went off. And God forbid what would happen today with the capacity of these particular weapons. Monsignor, final thoughts.
Right. Right now we have wars going on in multiple parts of the world. And those, we want to see peace be brought on. So I'm encouraging everybody to pray for peace daily. Prayer does make a difference. And the other thing we're going to have to for a little bit, because we have nation states that are bent on aggression and committing the crime of aggression, we'll have to deter them from further aggression against innocent human beings.
Monsignor, thank you for your time. Great to have you here, as always. Look forward to the next time we talk.
Thank you, Drew. Good to be with you.
God bless you. It's Monsignor Stuart Swetland.
Hey, like what you just heard? Then share it with your family and friends. And thanks for listening.